Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Underqualified. We got fancy with it. We flipped our backgrounds this time. We're going to keep you guys on your
Woohoo!
toes. We are recording this in the heat of early March Madness, if you will. So we're going to have some underdog and statistics-based topics today because everybody who's been making their brackets and just in sports in general can tell you that we absolutely love and talk far too much about stats and projections and who's supposed to win and by how much, and it just turns into a mess. So, we're going to talk about that mess a little bit, and we're going to talk about why we love a good Cinderella story. So, I'm going to let Benjamin go ahead and take over and talk
Great,
about some underdogs.
sweet. So yeah, hopefully when we release this episode, the tournament is at least still like going on, so it
Mm-hmm.
kind of makes sense to have the March Madness theme. But that was the inspiration for this episode. So yeah, I always grew up like that was one of the first things that I learned about watching sports was we root if we're not like if the team that I'm a fan of isn't in the game, root for the team that's not supposed to win.
Right.
And root against the teams like the New England Patriots or I don't know, like the Golden State Warriors during the last like decade of NBA basketball, teams that win a lot. We
Celtics and
always
Lakers historically, for sure.
right, yeah, yeah. We look at like to look at those teams or Alabama in college football.
Mm-hmm.
Love to root against them just because they like seem to win it every year. And so anytime there's a chance for the plucky underdog story that's not supposed to win to get in there and score an upset, I'm all about that and
Right.
always wanting that to happen. And that's a pretty common like sports phenomenon. We love to hate on winners. Um, while at the same time we all recognize that like that's there's something to be celebrated in that winning culture. We just don't ever really want to see the dominant force continue to be that way. We love to hate the Yankees, love to hate the Patriots, unless you're from Boston or New York. So um, let's talk a little bit about why we tend to feel that way. And so, well, actually, first, if we're talking specifically about the tournament, you got to think about uh, the biggest upset runs that have gone on that have become so like famous and storied. And the first one that pops into my head is the um, NC State run to the national championship when Jimmy V was the coach there, and
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of like lots of documentaries have been made about that in the last since that was like 1983, I think, and then there have been another of other significant ones. George Mason went pretty far back in 2006. The Davidson 2018 with Steph
Oh,
Curry,
yeah,
they
with
went
Steph
to
Curry.
the
Yep.
Elite Eight, and then of course,
He dropped 40 points in that game, did he not?
yeah, yeah, and of course Butler back in 2011 getting
Mm-hmm.
like that close to knocking off Duke in the national championship game, and then going back the next year and losing again, um, which was a tough one. VCU that same year, Florida Gulf Coast back in 2013, and Loyola Chicago just a couple years ago, and they're going to the Sweet 16 again this year after knocking off number one seed Illinois
I
just
was going to
on
say,
the day of this recording.
yeah,
So
I was going to say just this year, it's the first time in like NCAA history that four squads ranked 13 or below have made it into the round of 32. So
hmm
there's been some big upsets. I mean, this tournament, March Madness is always a disaster for people who like to make brackets, which is kind of the fun of it. It's kind of a
right.
glutton for punishment type thing. You do it to like see how this could possibly go wrong because there's so many games that things always fall apart. But this year, it happened instantaneously.
Right, and another sort of stat of a similar nature is that a team of every seeding number except for 16 advanced to the second round.
Wow.
So 1 through 15, all of those seeds are represented
Somewhere.
in round two. So there were upsets of all sorts and kinds, which as a casual fan, is great. It makes it great fun, and seeing things that we don't expect to happen in storylines of little pesky smaller schools that hang around with the big dogs.
Right.
And so to talk about that, there are a couple of different perspectives on why we love to root for the underdog. And the first one that came up as I was doing my research was talking about Schadenfreude, which
Okay.
is I think
Enjoying
I'm
other
pronouncing
people's
that right. Yeah,
misfortune.
enjoying other people's suffering,
Yeah.
which kind of bummed me out to think about it that way, because I always think of it as just rooting for the team that's not supposed to win, because it would be extra exciting for them since they didn't have that expectation. But also in my intro to this very topic, I talked about how much we love to root against the team that is dominant
Right.
and that is supposed to win. And so in like subconsciously, even though I wouldn't like to say, yeah, I just want to see the big teams lose and be sad. That was sort of how
Kind
I
of do.
framed the issue. Yeah, I kind of do want to see, like, I just want to see Tom Brady lose as many times as possible.
And he sure did not this year.
And I haven't been able to. It's a hard time when you just want to root against Tom Brady. But so Schadenfreude, I don't know very much about how it uh, manifests itself, but it's that idea of uh, taking joy from the suffering of others, which feels kind of but uh, while that's sort of the big um, psychological term, so we end up rooting for the underdogs over the winning team because we're envious that the winning team is doing well, and so if the underdog team pulls out a win, then it makes us feel better about maybe the team that we support not being in that position of success.
Mm-hmm.
And but like to phrase it in different ways that are sort of less cynical for your typical fan. Just in rooting for the underdog, the excitement during the game increases, and so there's just an inherent entertainment factor when a game is close and interesting. So that could be a part of it as well. Like if a team is supposed to get like blown out in a 1 seed, 16 seed situation, or a 2 seed, 15 seed situation, and just the game being close when it was supposed to be that one sided
Mm-hmm.
is more interesting to the casual fan. And that's sort of the logic that I would identify with more than saying, oh, I want to see all the 1 seeds lose. I don't feel particularly malicious, at least in the tournament setting, towards the schools that get those number 1 seeds. But
Yeah.
would I be happy if a 16 seed beat them? Yeah, because it'd be cool. It'd be cool to see it. It doesn't happen
Right.
very often. It's
Right.
only happened one time in the history of the tournament,
Mm-hmm.
which was UMBC, University of wait, what's UMBC?
I have no idea.
University of Maryland, British Columbia,
Baltimore campus.
or Baltimore County. Yeah,
There
yeah,
we
you're
go.
right. University of Maryland, Baltimore County. They upset Virginia, I think in 2016,
Yep.
maybe.
Within the last 5 years.
Within the last 5 years, when Virginia was the 1 seed, I think in the entire tournament, they were the top team.
Mm-hmm.
Virginia sort of has a history
I was
of
going to say, they're known for that, are they not?
losing early in the tournament. They got their last laugh a couple seasons. I think they were the defending champs this year, out again early in this tournament, but they finally got their moment in the sun last season. And so we love to see that. And in those situations where there's supposed to be no chance of something happening. It sort of makes the fan feel like they are a witness and part of something that is special and unique. And so if I sit down to watch a game and it plays out exactly the way every pundit and analyst has said that it will before the game, then that feels less engaging to me as a fan than if like a totally unexpected storyline that everybody got wrong.
Right.
That sort of appeals to this human nature of wanting to be special and significant and unique. So
Yeah, what's the point of watching if they're going to get everything right before it even happens?
exactly, yeah, that's the our mom has this saying of that's why they play the game.
Exactly.
So if everything was always going to go the way the analysts say, then we would just have people standing around talking about sports instead of actually playing it. So, and that's one of the reasons we love it. But there are a number of studies that have sort of found some data to back up what we can all easily observe, which is that people love to root for the underdog. But in one study, and I can't find where the study came from. It looks like humankinetics.com is where the link goes to, but the article that's talking about it is from Vox. And in one study, they presented descriptions of two fictional basketball teams playing against each other in a 7-game series. And 88.1% of people rooted for the team that was described as the underdog in this fake scenario. And that's sort of a good way to remove hometown bias or your favorite team. Like neither of these teams actually existed. It was just a fictional scenario in which people were like, do you want to root for the team that's supposed to win this game or the team that's trying to score the upset? And most people want to see the less common storyline. But when the situation was changed, so that people were told that the favorite to win this 7-game series unexpectedly lost the first 3 games of the series, so putting them on the brink of elimination.
Right.
And essentially making them the new underdog, about half of them changed their allegiance. So that's sort of interesting as well. So you can think of being the underdog based on like the quality of your team, or just finding yourself in a precarious situation with the game script and how sports can play out. So if you have a situation like the top seed in a tournament, in the NCAA tournament, gets down by 20 in the second half, and then mounts this miraculous comeback, even if it's to beat a Cinderella team, then that's probably still, the same little emotional kick for that game script as if the underdog team had won a close game. So I think it's that kind of throws off the Schadenfreude theory for rooting for underdogs, because by that logic, we should want to see like underdog teams blowing out these teams that are supposed to win, and taking so much pleasure in seeing them get obliterated. But really, like in sports, we just love storylines, we love exciting situations, we love not knowing what's going to happen. And so I think a lot of the statistics that I can find on this are really just backing up the idea that people love to watch close games, as opposed to the idea that people will always root for the underdog, although there is a body of evidence for that as well. In a separate study, American college students watched a game between European teams, and they were told that either one team or the other had won the last 15 games between them. So that's sort of historical dominance over a period of time. And again, most of the students in that study rooted for the underdog to spring an upset, regardless of which team was described as being the underdog. And so that's another sort of points to what I was talking about before, that we like to witness things that don't happen very often. So that's sort of the same line of thinking as why we want to go out and see like a shooting star when it comes by or some astrological abnormality. It just doesn't happen very often. We feel more significant when we experience things like that. And so that's another psychological element that feels more palatable to me than the Schadenfreude theory, because I'm just I'm just very uncomfortable with the idea that the only reason I like to root for little small schools in the NCAA tournament is because I want to see people suffer.
The big
But
schools suffer, yeah.
yeah, but there is a sort of a psychological basis for that. But and that's a it's not just like a fringe thing. That's a pretty popular theory that like yeah, it sort of comes back to that concept. But another way of phrasing it is we just sort of look for balance. We want the world to be fair, and so if the same team is winning every couple of years and has a history of having a winning program, and another school that has never been to the tournament before or never been in a championship situation before, then we're going to pick them because it's like it seems like it's their turn.
Sure.
And so that feels pretty logical as well. And another possible explanation is that people get more joy out of unexpected successes than expected ones, and experience more pain from unexpected failures than the ones that we anticipate. And so this could provide a good reason to root for the underdog. You have less to lose when your team loses and more to gain if it pulls off the upset.
Sure.
So no one specifically studied that idea. It's hard to identify statistics to back it up, but it's sort of a rational explanation. There are some limits on our desire to support the underdog. Basically, when there's something really at stake, our support sort of tapers off. So there was a study from the University of Richmond that participants read a scenario in which two companies competed for a contract, and one was a new sort of small struggling company, and the other a well-established decades-old one with a great reputation. And when asked, more than half of the participants, or slightly more than half of the participants, said they'd root for the small one, the upstart company, to land the contract. But the limits of that, if you shift the scenario so that the companies testing for were testing the water for potential cancer-causing chemicals in their own hometowns, the results were the opposite. So more than twice as many rooted for the established, reliable company to win the contract as opposed to the underdog upstart, because there's less of an expectation for that company to do well. Right. So we, as soon as we have something on the line as an audience member, our support for the underdog evaporates. We'll go back to the team or organization with the established record that we sort of know what we're going to get with them. So in sports, it's less that way, because most of us root for upsets without, whether it goes that way or not, it doesn't really impact us as sports fans. Right. And unless they come at the expense of our own team. So you wouldn't root for, if you're a Duke fan and they're, not this year, but they're usually a very high seed in the tournament, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, sweet, Duke lost to a 13 seed this year. Like, that's great. Because you have your personal investment, and that's going to take precedent over your sort of interest in witnessing an unusual, spectacular event. Yeah. So rooting for, the quote at the end of this article is, although rooting for the underdog is pervasive, the effect is a mile wide and an inch deep. So it affects everybody, but it's a very sort of fragile, a very fragile attachment to teams that, or situations that it's cool when it happens, unless we really have something on the line. Some other possible explanations, and then I'll go back and talk a little bit more about Schadenfreude just in the last couple minutes, just to sort of explain that, because I don't know that I've touched on it very well. But there was a study, and this is from Psychology Today now, so switching over to a different article.
Okay.
Participants were more supportive of Israel in its conflict with Palestine when Israel was framed as an underdog. And they found the same sort of divide between underdog and favorite in the context of Olympic events. And so that sort of represents the universal application of this sort of idea, that whether it's a military conflict or we're talking about sports, or there was that other example from the business world and with water treatment, we sort of transfer that idea. And so even like there's more on the line for individuals in the world in the Israel-Palestine conflict than there is in a March Madness game.
Right.
And we can logically understand that the stakes are higher for some people, but for your average American, the stakes are less personal. You can have a viewpoint on the conflict and you can have a side that you throw support towards, but unless you have family or friends that are directly involved, or you are from that area, it feels less personal, and so you're still sort of vulnerable to the underdog effect, despite what we were saying before with that earlier article, that as soon as there's stakes, we go to the favorite.
Right.
The key point being that those stakes are personal and not just intuited from the context of the situation. Which is that was interesting to me, that once the seriousness of the situation was amped up, that was still persistent. In another study, participants read a scenario about a team that was likely to lose. They described them as an underdog unless they had more financial resources than the opponent. So that suggests that being likely to lose is not necessarily enough to rally the troops in support of your team, because we want to feel good about ourselves. It seems easier to pick the favorite, but we'll lean towards the underdog. However, if a team is supposed to lose, but it takes on a certain connotation because of its background or resources, which sort of give it favorite top dog status, even though they're not supposed to win in the context of the storyline, or the sports storyline, independent of the actual game or competition, that can influence our viewpoint as well. So, and then back to this point on Schadenfreude, there are sort of driving factors on the Schadenfreude manifesting itself are aggression, rivalry, and justice. So that can Schadenfreudian, I don't know if that's a word, response to a situation can be motivated by any of those three things. So it can be primarily linked to aggression, which is really like wanting to see somebody suffer who is not supposed to. Like that is an aggressive inclination, versus rivalry. So that sort of gets into more of the personal investment. So I want to see this person do worse, because if they do worse, it's better for me as an individual. Or justice, which gets into more of what we were talking about before with the previous studies, which is it's an issue of regularity. And so if a team has been consistent and in winning in this rivalry, or has won the tournament a number of times, we think, all right, time to give somebody else.
We're good. Let's.
Yeah. That's why I don't think anybody needs to see Tom Brady win another Super Bowl unless you're from Tampa Bay. But I didn't mean to turn it into a Brady hating episode, and since we're mostly talking about March Madness, it's hard not to think of the guy when we're talking about top dogs.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So that sort of wraps it up. There's not a ton of like super hard empirical data on this. There have been a number of studies that sort of just conclude generally that when you frame things in a certain way, people will lean towards the underdog. But as soon as it becomes a real issue for that person, they're going to think, oh, I want to be on the team that's the favorite. I want to have them on my side because we all logically know that the outcome that is most likely is that the favorite is going to win out and the underdog is going to be sent packing. But if it doesn't impact us, then we love to see them reverse the script
Mm-hmm.
and do something different because we that as that article sort of concluded, we get more of an emotional kick from something that is surprising us. So yeah, but that's the sort of the science behind all the fun upsets that we've been enjoying in these first couple days of games in this year's March Madness tournament. So we'll transition over to talking about some more statistics.
Yeah, you actually you made perhaps unintentionally a really good segue, which is sort of talking about the difficulty of getting solid statistics when human research is involved. Specifically, social sciences and things of that nature are incredibly difficult to pin down from a statistical standpoint because humans and human society is so complex. The general concept of, well, I need to be eliminating these variables to have a better study really doesn't work. Um, but that perhaps is a discussion for another time, because what I really want to focus on is the misuse and misinterpretation of statistics that are correct, which is, in my opinion, a particularly dangerous subcategory to just sort of misunderstanding data. And the reason that I say that is that there is so much distrust in expert opinion right now that there is also, on the other side, almost a total blind faith in hard data and the
Hmm.
interpretation of that hard data. So you say, well, I can't trust the expert opinion over here, but this data is devoid of an expert opinion. It just exists on its own. And so this interpretation that I make, therefore, is valid because the data is valid. And so I'm going to be referencing a couple of different instances from this article from the Wharton College of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, I believe is what it is. And a couple of different, I'm not going to say famous, but perhaps well-known instances in which data has been intentionally or unintentionally misinterpreted. And so the first is when Mitch McConnell published a report that indicated that Roger Clemens and more than 80 other high profile and sort of regular profile Major League Baseball players had used illegal performance enhancing substances to either prolong or salvage their careers. Um, for those of us who are baseball fans, we are all well aware that there is a period in the 90s and into the early 2000s where steroid use was rampant and led to things like Barry Bonds breaking the home run record, which is still contested because he was very obviously using steroids when he broke that record. So there's still people who think that that shouldn't count. People were pitching into their 40s at levels that had never been seen before. So things of that nature. So it was a big deal in the baseball community. And so Roger Clemens, unsurprisingly, took issue with being accused of using performance-enhancing drugs, and he went. I can't remember. Let's see. Oh, he testified. So he did. He did go to court. Essentially, he testified before Capitol Hill with his absolutely gargantuan report that was created on his behalf by a marketing agency to clear his name. And so very adamantly declared his innocence in this whole performance enhancing drug world and said, I understand that I was pitching at a time where this was really common, but I was not one of those people. And so Wharton faculty came back and was looking at the statistical analysis that was used and says that it's not as valid as Roger Clemens would have liked us to believe. Um, and the issue with that starts with just the sheer volume of data that we are now exposed to as a general public, which is a good thing, but can also become an issue because we are exposed to it so much that it's sort of, you talk about like violence on TV or beer ads on TV. A similar thing happens with data where we just sort of get desensitized to, well, I have this paper that says N. And you say, all right, fine, whatever, there's a paper, and it's really easy to fall into that and saying, well, because there's evidence, I'll just drop it. The problem in this particular instance is the way that the data was collected. So the crux of Clemens' argument centered around a couple other pitchers whose names that you will know, Nolan Ryan, Randy Johnson, and Curt Schilling. All men who pitched well into their 40s and continued to pitch at an elite level at the late stages of their career. So Clemens' argument centered around, I am not an aberration. There are other men who have done this in Major League Baseball. What I achieved is not even that strange. That was the crux of what he was getting at. Which, if you use those men as your benchmark, is true. He was not particularly an aberration from the data presented by those men. The problem came when you compared Clemens to the average lifespan, if you will, of a pitcher in Major League Baseball and to the overall careers that those other men had. So they continued to pitch at a fairly consistent level for their entire career. Which, they pitched into their late 40s. So we're talking like a 20 plus year career in Major League Baseball, which is very rare. And so it stacks up when you first look at it. But what you realize afterwards is that Clemens's career actually tailed towards the end of his 20s and into his 30s. So he wasn't as dominant as he was when he first came into the league. And then actually, as he got older, he somehow returned and even exceeded his prior level of performance. And so those other men, they had a career that, was high above all the other pitchers, just as Roger Clemens was, but really by and large stayed up here. And Clemens had a notable decline and then came back up as he got older. And so this is a fantastic example of what's called selection bias and is one of the dangers of what this article refers to as statisticians for hire. Because this data is correct. None of it is false. All of the stats about Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling and Nolan Ryan were true. And so in comparison, Roger Clemens looked like he had a really strong leg to stand on at the time. The problem is that the camp, if you will, that was creating this data was done so on behalf of Clemens.
Sure.
And so it was a way for him to repair his image. So the data held him in a favorable, not guilty light. This article does not go on to actually accuse him of using steroids, but it does warn that when you are hiring someone to get data on your behalf, the likelihood that they will skew that data to favor you is high. And some people do that entirely unknowingly, and some people do that very intentionally. And so another one that often happens is that we just have false concepts of what should occur. And they warn you about this in entering into scientific studies all the time, that you can form your hypothesis, but you should not use it as an interpretation of what you think the results need to be, which as a scientist, you want your study to work the way that you think that it's going to. So it can be really hard to avoid this. And it talks about, interestingly enough, baseball again. And one of the people who was authoring this article talked about a study about whether baseball players are better catching fly balls that are behind them or in front of them in the outfield. And so they went into the study saying that running forward to catch a ball would always be the better option because it stays in front of you the whole time. It's the natural trajectory for you're carrying your hand forward to the ball. It just made logical sense to the researchers that that would be the more reliable way to catch a baseball. So by encouraging the outfielders to play deep, keep the ball in front of them, they would have a higher chance of catching the ball. What actually turns out is that like 88% of the time, it's more reliable to have the ball hit over their head.
Oh, wow.
And at least in the results of this study, to be clear. And so the reasoning for that they discerned is that it's simply because if the ball is carrying long enough to be over their head, it will likely at the same time be higher. And so because it's higher, the player will actually have more time to get their glove up to make the catch and will be better off adjusting, falling back, well, not falling, but going backwards than going forward at a dead sprint to catch a ball that's in front of them. And so it's just, another interesting example of how like they started this entire study anticipating what the results are going to be, and then were found to be completely wrong. And so the real danger with this, obviously, the Clemens thing is a somewhat small scale impact, because if you don't care about baseball, it really doesn't matter, right?
Right.
You couldn't care less whether or not Roger Clemens used steroids because you probably don't know who he is. And so the issue comes in with social policy and all sorts of political decisions that will intentionally misinterpret this data, like what I'm talking about. And so I have a couple examples here that I'm actually going to pull up and show to you that weren't necessarily political issues, but are just ways that without knowing the full context of the situation, you could rapidly misinterpret and misuse the data. So in the 1970s, approximately 1 in 5,000 individuals was diagnosed with autism. And we come here to 2009, and we see 1 in 110, which that seems, over the course of just over, not even 40 years, right? A nearly exponential increase in diagnosis. Which, if you don't know the context of what was going on in the background while this was happening, that can be extremely misleading. Because what happened right around 1995 or into 2000, I don't have the exact date, is there was a sweeping alteration to the way that autism was categorized and diagnosed. So they formulated a much better, much more complete, comprehensive list of symptoms and experiences that people on the autism spectrum could be experiencing that could lead to a diagnosis of autism, as well as just expanding what could qualify you to be on the spectrum of autism.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is actually representative of a statistical correction, if that makes sense. So the results in the early 2000s are actually likely to be the more correct results than in 1975. But if you don't know anything about the progression of diagnosis of autism, this could be a really concerning graph. And it has been used on occasion as anti-vaxxer evidence, which is something that we've talked about before.
I
Uh,
figured that was probably going to go in that direction. And
yep,
so that's sort of why, um, speaking statistically, it's important to talk about these things because they do manifest themselves in harmful misunderstandings.
yep,
And so it's not just data, oh, big whoop, data gets misinterpreted. No, it's, action that follows these ill-advised conclusions.
yep.
So I'm glad we're sort of bringing this up. But,
And so I want to reiterate again that this data, obviously there's no true data here. It's a graph. There's no numbers. Is not wrong, right? This is correct. This information is provided accurately, but it is almost entirely devoid of context. And it says, by some counts, autism diagnoses have climbed steadily since the 70s, but there's research that has found explanation for more than 50% of this increase. And so this is just one of the many examples. I mean, I literally just Googled autism graph. This is not cited. It's not vetted by anything. It just happens to be here. But I know from prior experience that this graph is true. And so again, this can be misinterpreted and used for a political agenda without the rest of the context. So I'm going to stop the share briefly, and then I'm going to start it up again. And bonk and bonk. There we go. And so this is cancer prevalence and projections in the U.S. population from 1975 until 2040. And so we've got our date in 5-year increments on the bottom, and then cancer prevalence per in millions across the timeline. So we are right here, and then the projection goes off to the right. So we don't even necessarily have to consider this extrapolated data. We can just look within like where we actually are. But let's talk about the like shocking, perhaps, increase here that we're seeing. Looks very similar to the autism graph, I would say. It's perhaps not quite
mm-hmm.
as exponential, but it is a drastic increase. And then here's your age down at the bottom. So there's a couple of reasons for this. The first and perhaps most important is this checked blue line right here. And that is when the baby boomers turn 65.
Mm.
So the baby boomers are the largest single population cohort that the United States has ever had. And so as they continue to age, they continue to break records across the board in terms of medical needs and expenses, which makes sense because there has never been a group as large as theirs. And so cancer is, by and large, a disease of the elderly because it stems from your body no longer being able to regulate its cells appropriately, leading to damage to your DNA that leads to forced replication, which leads to what we know as cancer. And that is more statistically likely the older and older that you get. So it would make sense as the largest generation in American history gets older that the cancer diagnosis rate would increase as they reach the age that cancer becomes common.
Yeah.
There's a couple other things that apply to this. The second is just that the average American is living longer than they did in 1975. So generations that preceded the baby boomers are still alive, and they are continuing to be diagnosed with cancer. And the other thing is that cancer screenings have vastly improved. And so if you're catching something at stage 1 or stage 2 as opposed to stage 4. If you're just looking at overall cancer diagnosis, those are all equal, right? It's a diagnosis is a diagnosis is a diagnosis. But in terms of longevity and survivability for that individual who has cancer, the stage at which it is diagnosed is obviously of immense importance. Because if we are catching something like breast cancer at stage 1 or stage 2, we have a lot of options that someone can undergo in order to prolong their life post diagnosis with stage 1 or 2 cancer, really of any kind. So this number continues to climb because people are living post cancer diagnosis, which back in the day, not even 1975, but longer ago than that, first of all, people often did not live long enough to get diagnosed with cancer, so they would be killed by something else. Or once they did get cancer, it was a precipitous decline. They didn't live very long and they passed shortly after diagnosis because there just wasn't anything to be done. And so that one has been used for political discussion to a certain extent. There's people who are very concerned about carcinogens that are used in manufactured foods or that have been produced into the atmosphere from, power plants and things of that nature that say the reason that we have so much more cancer now is because of all of this crap in our air and our water and our food. Which, to be perfectly honest, the evidence just does not bear that out. And I want to be really clear, I'm not saying that those things are good. I'm not saying that the carcinogens in our air and our water and our food are fine and things that we shouldn't be concerned about. They're absolutely things that we should be concerned about and they shouldn't be in our food. However, the overarching evidence shows that the number one way to get cancer is to get old. Always. For every type of cancer, for every prevalence, likelihood, all of it. It's just you get old enough to the point that your cells do not replicate the way that they're supposed to because they can't. The defense mechanisms that are there fade with age. And so across the board, the reason by and large that people get cancer is because they get old, which is a good thing. And I think is something that gets lost a little bit in the wash of this discussion, right? Like, we have improved public health to the point that people get old enough to get cancer.
Right. Yeah.
Which seems like kind of a backwards way to think about it because we so often say, well, cancer is bad. Yes, cancer is bad. I'm not saying that cancer is a good thing, but excluding pediatric cancer, which is pretty much without fail is a genetic issue, excluding pediatric cancer, cancer occurs when people get old. So the fact that their cancer rate is going up, it means that more of our population is able to get old. And so
I'm sure that without having looked at the statistic, this trend is sort of transferable to a lot of ailments that develop later in life. So Alzheimer's or dementia or other things that tend to come on late in life. Yeah, it's just a lot of people are living longer. It doesn't mean that someone struggling with Alzheimer's is any less tragic now.
Right.
It just means that we have more people getting to that stage of life, which means that we deal with that affliction more frequently. But,
and I think perhaps the point that I'm most trying to make with a graph like this is the problem that this makes good news. In that this gets people to watch, the 10 p.m., the 6 a.m. news broadcast on your local news channel. Because the headline, cancer diagnosis rates are the highest that it's ever been, scares people. Reasonably so. And again, that is a blatant well, it's not a misinterpretation, a complete removal of context from that data. Because is this data correct? Yes, it is. It's absolutely correct. But to say cancer rates are through the roof is blatant misinformation. Because, first of all, we're catching cancer by and large earlier than we ever have in the history of human medicine. Two, more people are old enough to get cancer. And three, because our treatments are steadily, slowly, but steadily improving, people are living longer post-diagnosis of cancer. So the total like carrying capacity, if you will, of cancer patients around the world is continuing to rise because we are able to treat them post-diagnosis. And so what the world has really landed in, if you will, and this is something that as someone in a STEM field I'm really passionate about, is that we have to toe the line between trusting the expert opinion and actually reading the paper.
Hmm.
Because I am not telling you that what every expert has to say is a lie. But if you can, read the paper. Read about the way that they are collecting and interpreting their data. If they are selecting from a specific group of individuals intentionally, I would be concerned about the interpretations of the data in that paper. They might still be valid, but that sounds like selection bias right out of the gate.
Hmm. And that's a part of studies, regardless of topic, that should be fairly consistent. And so, if that's the one part of the study that you read, read about their survey process and their
Mm-hmm.
data collection. And that's purely statistical analysis, and that's why having a proficiency in talking about statistics is so important, and why it's so concerning that people in administrative positions don't have basic understanding of how data can be represented. And
Yeah.
so there are a lot of decisions in a variety of different contexts that are made based on data, but the conclusions that are being reached are so disjointed from the statistical reality.
Yeah.
That happens in educational policy, that happens in small businesses and large corporations, and it certainly happens in government. And it's a big problem. It's a universally applicable problem,
One of
whether it's science or government.
this what is the name of this? The Wharton article that I actually started this piece with has a section on small business, which I actually had just completely forgotten about until you brought it up. So really, to bring this home and to sort of close things out here, it talks about a retailer that is running, their quarterly earnings report, and they see this correlation between when they lower their prices and a decrease in sales. And so the owner of the store or the CEO of the small company, whatever, however you want to extrapolate this analogy, is concerned by this seemingly erroneous correlation, because basic laws of economics will dictate that when you lower your price, your demand goes up, so you should sell more. That's like macroeconomics 101. If you raise the price, less people want to buy it because it's more expensive. And so they come to this conclusion that for whatever reason, when they lower their price, their sales get worse. And they're very concerned about this. So they hire a statistician who comes in and he examines the data, and he realizes that what is actually happening is that when their sales get low, they have a sale.
Mm.
And so what is actually happening is that when sales decrease, they intentionally decrease the prices of their products to improve sales. And so again, all of that data is correct, but it was instantly and concerningly for the people in this fictitious company interpreted completely incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
So trust the experts, but read the paper.
Yeah. At least read the section on procedures
Yep.
and make your own conclusion.
As always, thank you all so much for watching. We really appreciate the continued participation that we're getting on these videos. The last one got like 25, 30 views, which again, it boggles my mind that people continue to be interested in listening to us talk about things
Yeah,
on a regular
for a
basis.
while.
For a while, like
To
almost an
to
hour.
quote to quote John Mulaney, a guy with no expertise is gonna talk for a
A
while.
while. uh,
So we appreciate it. We appreciate the love.
As always, the three rules of our podcast is that we will try to do everything in our power to say things that are accurate to the best of our knowledge. If you are someone who knows more about the fields that we are talking about than we do, and we either say something incorrect or you just want to participate, we require you by court of law to comment underneath the video about what you know, about what we got wrong, or about what you want to share. And number three, and perhaps most importantly, is be nice. We're doing this because we like to. It's fun for us to talk to each other about things that we think are cool, and we hope that you guys are enjoying it. As always, if you have other things that you would like for us to talk about, please leave them in the comments below. We're always looking for new ideas. And thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're doing well.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.